This is the only story in the Gospels of Jesus' childhood. I also find it one of the more believable stories in the Gospels. It's a pretty easy one to understand. A child gets lost. I mean, that happens. I thought you had him. No, I thought you had him. I thought you were picking him up. No, I thought you were picking him up. Well, we better go pick him up. And you get there and he's not there. Well, where is he? And you start to get frantic and you start to get worried and you start to call, his friends' houses. Maybe he went home with a friend. Okay. Are you going to do that throughout the sermon if you don't like something? I remember when I got lost once, I wasn't lost. I knew exactly where I was. I was in the toy department, It was my parents who couldn't find me. It was their problem, So it's a very believable story. And that, Mary ponders these in her heart. Yeah, I mean, you remember these stories. Sometimes we still tell stories. We told kids stories when we were with our children this Christmas, along these lines, because you remember these things that stand out. You have no evidence of how Luke knew this story. You just wonder, maybe Mary told him. Who else would have told him the story? These stories of children, of childhood, of famous people is a common thing in ancient literature, and it's kind of common in current literature. There were childhood stories of Augustus. There was of Buddha, of Osiris, of Cyrus. I was brought up on childhood stories of Abraham Lincoln, of George Washington. I mean, throwing the dollar across the Potomac and then getting signed by the New York Giants as their quarterback. The story of, chopping down the cherry tree and not telling a lie. I remember a childhood series of books of famous people, what Robert E. Lee was like as a child, what Ulysses Grant was like as a child, what Eisenhower was like as a child, Harriet Tubman as a child, Martin Luther King. Well, yeah, for my kids, Martin Luther King as a child. I always was amazed in these stories how they knew the dialogue between Abraham Lincoln and his father. How did they know that? I thought, did they already know he was going to be famous? Was there somebody going around taking notes on their conversation? How did they know that? It never dawned on me that the writer was kind of making these things up. Why do we tell those childhood stories of famous people? Well, partly it could be, I wonder if Luke put this story in to keep the kids' interest when they were sitting in worship. Oh, here's a story about Jesus as a boy. I better listen. I'm getting close to 12. I better listen. Maybe there's no other purpose for the story than to keep kids involved in listening to what's being read and told. Another reason could be what I call the child as father to the man, that you see things in the child that become fully developed in the adult. Washington not telling a lie, Lincoln and his reading. I remember Robert E. Lee and his discipline and his obedience. And the child grows up to become the man. So we get hints in the child. Also, it can be going backwards too. I mean, we see these traits in the adult, and we just project them onto the child. Well, the child must have been like this growing up. There are themes in this story of Jesus in the temple that show up throughout the Gospel of Luke. Jesus debating and talking with the priests and the rabbis. That shows up a lot with the adult Jesus. He spends the last week of his life debating in the temple, being questioned and so on. That the crowds were astonished at his teaching. That shows up several times in the Gospel of Luke, where people, they're so astonished by his wisdom, they can't respond. And that happens in this story. The tension between his parents, his family, and himself shows up a lot in the Gospels. There's always friction usually between Mary and Jesus, where Jesus says, "I must be about my Father's business," foreshadows the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus says, "Not my will, but thine be done." His obedience to the law shows up in the Gospel of Luke. And then there's 3 days that he's lost. The 3 days that he's lost, and on the third day he's found. What's that foreshadow? The resurrection. Yeah, he's lost for 3 days, and then he's found. So you get these themes that show up in the adult Jesus. Now since this is the only story of Jesus between birth and the beginning of his ministry, which is projected around he's 30, writers have filled in the blanks with their own stories. Novelists really have a field day with this kind of stuff. Some of the blanks that people put in there, how they fill the blanks, are, well, maybe Jesus spent those early years traveling around the world to China and India and Afghanistan and learning other religions. Maybe he spent the early years in Egypt with the large Jewish community in Alexandria. There are childhood stories of Jesus, being bored and making birds out of clay to play with. There are stories of his being bullied and at one of the bullies. You don't mess with the childhood Jesus. There are stories of when the crowd calls him to accountability for this act of striking the bully dead. He strikes the crowd blind. You get kind of weird stuff with Jesus. There's a story of a scorpion biting one of his friends' hand and Jesus healing the person. There are other stories of Jesus, wishing it would rain and it rains. Wishing it would snow and it snows. All these kind of things. Of his witnessing Joseph's crucifixion, of his witnessing a Roman soldier being killed by rebels. None of this there's any documentation for. It's just we fill in the blanks with these stories. One of the stories that really interests me is from a novel that Anne Rice wrote. Anne Rice is the vampire, Interview with a Vampire. And she's written 2 books about Jesus' early life. She talks about Jesus living in this extended family of cousins and aunts and uncles. And it isn't just Mary and Joseph, it's this large family. And they do start out in Egypt, in Alexandria, with the Jewish community there, because they were told, and Joseph was told in a dream, to flee Bethlehem and go to Egypt. So Jesus spent the first several years of his life in Egypt. And as he was growing up, he would hear snippets of family history. And he would hear cousins and his brothers and sisters talking about angels and talking about the visit of magi from the east and talking about shepherds and gold that the family had. And he'd hear these stories, and he'd start to put these stories together, and he'd start to also think about he was different. and he was unusual. If he could say, I wish it would snow, and it would snow, he realized there was something special about him. But he couldn't put his finger on it. When the family returns to Israel and goes up to the Passover when he's 12, Jesus decides that he's going to talk to some rabbis and try to figure out who he is. So he talks to this rabbi, and he talks to this rabbi for several days, and the rabbi then takes him to the scholars. And Jesus questions the rabbi about, well, what is the Messiah supposed to be? Are there texts in the Bible that tell us who the Messiah is and how the Messiah is to operate? And the rabbi goes through, Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophets, explaining to Jesus, this is what the Messiah is supposed to be like. And then Jesus starts to ask questions of the rabbis and the scholars about, what about this birth 12 years ago? What about this birth where the angels appeared to shepherds? And the rabbi says, yeah, we've heard stories of that ourselves. And Jesus says, what about these magi that came from the east looking for this child? And one of the priests says, oh yeah, I remember when they visited here. And we searched through Micah and we found out that this child was supposed to be born in Bethlehem. And so we sent him to Bethlehem. He said, yeah, I did that research for Herod. Jesus says, what happened to the child? And one of the rabbis says, he didn't live. He didn't live. What do you mean he didn't live? What happened to him? Well, we don't talk much about it anymore. It's too horrible to talk about. It's too horrible a story. What happened? Well, Herod was jealous, and he sent his soldiers to Bethlehem and had all the male children under 2 killed. They said that the child didn't live. And Jesus turns to the rabbi and says, the child escaped. The child escaped. And at that point, Mary and Joseph show up, and the conversation stops, and they take him home. Yeah. And Jesus then confronts Mary on the way home and says, why didn't you tell me? And she said, okay, sit down here. I'm going to tell you this story once. And she goes through what we know as the first 2 chapters of Luke's gospel. What Jesus is looking for in his going to the temple for this 3-day period, what Jesus is looking for is his identity. He's trying to figure out who he is. And that's a common theme, maybe the most prevalent theme in all these stories where authors fill in the blanks of Jesus' life. He's trying to figure out who he is. And he learns at the temple in those 3 days who he is and what he's to be about. Jesus is looking for his identity. I always like that theme because I've spent a lot of my life looking to figure out who I am. And you think about it, most of the Christmas story is about people looking for Jesus, for better or for worse. The shepherds look for Jesus. The magi look for Jesus. Even Herod looks for Jesus. And it seems that in looking for Jesus, people are defining and identifying who they are. Jesus responds to Mary by saying, "Did you not know I would be about my Father's business?" A lot of times that's translated as, "I should be in my Father's house." There's no justification in the Greek for it to say my Father's house. Actually, what the Greek says, I should be about my Father's stuff. That kind of strikes me as an authentic 12-year-old statement. I mean, that's what a 12-year-old would say. I should be about my Father's stuff. I can't think of a better word, than stuff. Usually it's translated my Father's business or my Father's things. But I should be about my Father's stuff. And he says, I must be about it. I mean, he clearly gets his identity here. I must be about my Father's stuff. And he grows up and he preaches that first sermon in Nazareth. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, liberty to the oppressed, release to the prisoners, and the acceptable year of the Lord. That's the stuff of the Father. And he spends the rest of his life living out the stuff of the Father and identifying who he is to the rest of the world. I like it that it doesn't say, in my Father's house, because that limits Jesus and us to the stuff of the church. But I must be about my Father's business, or I must be about my Father's stuff, takes him out into the world and takes us out into the world to express our faith and to live our faith. So where do we find Jesus? In the stuff of God. And Colossians explains that, I think, so. The stuff of God is compassion and kindness and patience and gentleness and forgiveness and love. That's the stuff of God where we find Jesus. And I think we do find Jesus when we are forgiving and when we are forgiven. Both are humble acts where we can receive God and experience God's presence and Jesus' presence. We do find Jesus in acts of gratitude. That's another place where we receive Jesus. And when we're patient and we put aside our need for control is where we find Jesus and find our identity. At the end of that book by Anne Rice, as Jesus struggles with who he is, and he's trying to figure out what he's about. He says, I realized that I was sent here to be alive. He has seen all this death, he's heard about all this death, and he realizes he's not going to be about death. He's going to be about being alive. That's his identity, to be alive. And isn't that what we're looking for? Isn't that what we're looking for when we look for Jesus? We're looking to be alive. We're looking to be loving. We're looking to be forgiven and forgiving. We're looking to be patient. We're looking for the fullness of life. Shouldn't we be about our Father's stuff? May it be so.